coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
You look at how our monetary system is doing, the financial system, these institutions, these structures are ailing profoundly, not just in the US, but across the West, and to a degree around the world. And they need a sort of access to some fresh blood. Where is it going to come from? Where can you sort of wring value out of some kind of systematic transformation that hasn't been undertaken yet? And obviously the answer is, mine the children. If you're not going to mine them for their blood, although some people are trying to do this, mine them for their stem cells, already happening to fetuses. You got to mine them of their souls and of their physical bodies. These will be the sites where we are going to generate vast amounts of value because we've sort of wrung everything else out to dry.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at The American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of The American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. And it's a full house today. I am joined by editor James Poulos, managing editor Seth Barron, publisher and president Ryan Williams, and Frabjous Kalu Kalei, contributing editor Helen Roy, who likes to hop on the pod from time to time. So we're going to jump right into it. This week, it's Pride Month, brought to you by Satan. We'll start off with a story about Target and then move into a few other stories about sort of quasi-satanic or indeed perhaps Satanist and satanic efforts to sell trans gear to kids and adults, one and all. Target, the famous store. I don't know how to, you know what Target is. It's a vast retail chain favored by housewives across the country, has launched, like many brands, has begun rolling out a Pride collection. And a few things are of note about this particular collection, besides the fact, of course, that it is being unveiled in the increasingly fractious and intense series of passionate debates over this whole transing the kid atrocity, but also that part of this collection at Target was designed by a UK-based brand called Abprallen. I think that's how you say it, headed by a transgender, it's reported as a man, so I guess this is a woman, female to male, known as Eric. It includes sweatshirts and tote bags with messages that include live, laugh, lesbian, cure transphobia, not trans people, too queer for here, and we belong everywhere. And Abprallen also sells apparel that includes satanic imagery, including pentagrams, horned skulls, and references to the devil. This has sparked outrage of a kind that is being compared and analogized to the response to Dylan Mulvaney's kind of Bud Light collab. And questions have been raised as to whether the reaction will be similarly consequential. I mean, when it came to Bud Light, conservatives started to feel like maybe they were finally mobilizing the power of the purse. On the other hand, a certain brand of doomer will tell you that there's simply no fighting back against this massive conglomeration of various gajillion-dollar corporations, because if you switch from one to the other, you'll just end up out of the frying pan and into the fire. But Target has had to roll back some of this material after the backlash, or what's being called, I suppose, the conservative backlash. These things are typically framed in the news as like conservative pounce. But I'm sure everybody on this cast can agree to start off that this is justifiable outrage, that it represents the increasingly embattled and kind of righteous anger of people of really any number of political persuasions. Conservative Christians, yes, but also just kind of normal parents who are a bit taken aback or caught off guard by the extremism represented in these brands, by the total inappropriateness of their placement and their, in some cases, availability or even marketing to children. There have been images circulated of a swimsuit that you can wear that's, I guess it's called tuck friendly. I'm not going to degrade us by going too deep into what that means, but it has to do with if you're like a man who considers himself trans, you might wear this swimsuit and feel, I suppose, more physically comfortable at the beach. What to say? Whenever Helen joins us, I feel at full liberty to indulge in my sort of ravings about demonic activity and supernatural forces. And so maybe, Helen, I'm going to kick this off to you. I mean, what are we to make of this? Is the conservative response enough, or have we yet taken into account this? Have we not yet taken into account the spiritual dimension of all of this?
So nice to be the token
to set you up as the token fantasy. But I'm right there with you. I'm just using you as an excuse to indulge in my own extremist rantings.
Yeah, well, golly, I mean, it's funny to me. It's always funny to me in a dark and twisted way how these things that are once memes and perhaps originate as memes, like, rainbow Satanism or whatever, just eventually completely and fully express themselves as unironic, like undeniable, on its face, explicit reality. I am not usually hopeful about boycotts, but I am about both of these, about the Bud Light thing and now the Target thing, in different ways. It's like it's for moms and dads, And the dads have really taken action with the Bud Light thing. I mean, my husband keeps sending me pictures of like, they can't clear the shelves. They're trying to sell like a 24 pack for, $3, and they cannot clear the shelves of this Bud Light at Walmart. And they're eventually going to have to start buying, back from the distributors, which is totally unheard of and insane. And like, that's a very significant loss. And so, Target is this place in America. It's actually one of the few places that actually feels kind of child friendly. Like a lot of suburban moms can go with their kids and get their Starbucks and just sort of like walk around the aisles in the middle of the day and feel, just have some fun, So I'm hopeful from what I've seen on TikTok, the response I've seen on TikTok and Instagram, which are really the more womanly platforms. I think that moms are having a similar response. I think there were plenty who stopped going when they did the bathroom thing, and then plenty more who were just like, okay, well, we just won't use the bathroom. But this, especially the tucking thing, which I know it's gross to mention, it really is. But the idea, so tucking and binding are these two things that the trans movement is pushing hard on children. It's like a pre-surgical way to mutilate yourself. So binding, Target sells binders too, is there are these contraptions that are sort of like bras, but they so tightly wrap the breasts of developing girls, prepubescent girls, that they can't grow, or when they do, they grow in like extremely deformed ways. And then tucking is a less permanent thing, especially if it's just in a bathing suit or whatever. But they have contraptions for that too, where like little boys, developing boys will like pull their penis back and restrict it, and it can do real damage to themselves in this way. And I think that this really is the bridge too far. It's no longer in the realm of ideas. This is like, these are things that actually physically permanently harm children. And, Cully, if this isn't enough to make people stop shopping at Target, I really don't know what is. But I'm hopeful.
Well, to borrow the one of the meme templates that has been going around now for many years in reference to those horrible right wingers, the damage is the point. The damage is the point, and I'm going to just sort of do my thing here and read a few quotes from various communists and communist sympathizers and let the words speak for themselves, because I'm just really I mean, every morning, you wake up and you check your phone and it's like just like about quote unquote trans stuff. The first freaking thing you see every morning if you are anywhere near this business that we are in. I've had to change my, now very naive seeming goal of going like one day without having like these sort of phenomena like in my head one day to now like 1 hour. That is the new standard. So why is it happening? Let's hear some quotes about the Novoy Sovietsky Человек, the new Soviet person. About 100 years ago, maybe a little bit less. Let's listen to Leon Trotsky, 1924, Literature and Revolution. Here's the quote about the communist man, the man of the future. Man will make it his purpose to master his own feelings, to raise his instincts to the heights of consciousness, to make them transparent, to extend the wires of his will into hidden recesses, and thereby to raise himself to a new plane, to create a higher social biologic type, or, if you please, a Superman. Wilhelm Reich, 1933. Will the new socioeconomic system reproduce itself in the structure of the people's character? If so, how? Will his traits be inherited by his children? Will he be a free, self-regulating personality? Will the elements of freedom incorporated into the structure of the personality make any authoritarian forms of government unnecessary? Pravda described the Soviet woman as someone who had and could never have existed before. I could go on and on. I'm really just pulling this stuff off of Wikipedia, which is still like accidentally based sometimes. Like we've been here for a long time. And, you know, the technology has only now caught up to this aspiration to turn the self into the sort of final site of politics, of war, of conflict, of destruction and rebuilding, remaking. The view that our given humanity, rather than being something sacred, was an obstacle to freedom, to justice, to the future, to power. These are thoughts that have been knocking around for a long time. And, you know, I don't think you can blame them on something like cultural Marxism, whatever you want to describe that is. These are deep things. These are spiritual things. And our technology has been quite, intentionally pushed in a direction that maybe unintentionally led to some of these things escaping the barn or whatever, becoming sort of seizing the imagination. But in hindsight, it's obvious that these sort of technologies would have such a transformative effect. The things that you're describing, Helen, you see them in Target and you're like, wow, the craziness. Why is there such craziness? Well, it's like, you look at how our socioeconomic system is doing. You look at how our monetary system is doing, the financial system. These institutions, these structures are ailing profoundly, not just in the US, but across the West, and to a degree around the world. And they need a sort of like, access to some fresh blood. Where is it going to come from? Where can you sort of wring value out of some kind of systematic transformation that hasn't been undertaken yet? And obviously the answer is, mine the children. If you're not going to mine them for their blood, although some people are trying to do this, mine them for their stem cells, already happening to fetuses. You got to mine them of their souls and of their physical bodies. These will be the sites where we are going to generate vast amounts of value because we've sort of wrung everything else out to dry. It's all too easy to understand kind of why we are where we are and how, unless sort of major sort of spiritual reorientation takes place, this is going to accelerate faster and it's going to spread further. And in spite of the fact that it is so destructive and damaging, or to be even darker about things, precisely because it is so destructive and damaging, in a world where people cannot change the trajectory of their future, they will radically turn on themselves to radically change their own trajectory. You don't have to be a Nietzschean to read Nietzsche say something like, in the time of peace, a warlike man will turn upon himself and see what's going on right now and start to connect the dots. People are desperate for agency, desperate for identity, and in the vacuum that's being opened up around us in that regard, they will turn against their given selves quite vengefully, and that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, it's I agree. And I see a lot of this as more of the, making manifest that which is hidden. And, as far as like everybody likes to get things out in the open, it's always like healthy and salubrious. So I guess in that sense, Target is doing us a favor. I think it would be great if a boycott would work. It occurred to me like, because I had said that I didn't think the Bud Light boycott would work a few weeks ago. And I guess I was wrong. And I sort of think that's because like men who drink Bud Light, the whole association with beer commercials and pretty ladies in bikinis, like that's an old thing. And, I guess the argument is like, drink this beer and this could be your girlfriend. And then Bud Light just so crudely inserted Dylan Mulvaney into the role of like the sex object. And I think maybe that's where they really went awry, like saying like, oh, here's your new object of desire, guys. And maybe that just like really, I think maybe that was just like a little too far. There might be, I've seen a few people on TikTok and social media, like women saying, okay, that's enough. I'm not going to do this. But I don't know. I mean, I still come back to this phenomenon that like our friend Peachy Keenan identified recently of like, or others have too, of like the woke yokel and, how LGBT pride has just gone so down market. I'm not sure that the people who shop at Target aren't, kind of Satanists themselves. So I don't know. We'll see. We'll see.
I did not envision you going the problem is us route, Seth. That's pretty good, but it's true in its own way. The other riff would be, sex sells. This should be across all marketing departments, but actually it turns out that only biologically valid sex sells, especially for beer. I just wanted to introduce some levity. The last one I'll do is that the Babylon Bee had a good one that said, suburban housewife ends boycott of Target after spending 3 minutes in Walmart. Unfair to Walmart mostly, but so I retracted, but I chuckled. We also should, I think we've mentioned it before in a different context, but part of this also is that the dual forces, there's actually three forces behind the scenes or sort of institutional that are working, this is the latest evolution in a way. It's maybe a little attenuated, but of our post-1991 Civil Rights Act regime, where, that's when, as Gail Harriet, the great law scholar from USD, has documented, it's when they put real teeth in workplace discrimination, sexual harassment stuff, and I would include in that now inclusion and all the rest. And it's when companies first started to really freak out and sort of overcompensate. Well, maybe not overcompensate. They were all worried about getting sued and losing real money. So it's when this regime of training videos and hypersensitivity to all this started. So I think there's part of that too, that the corporate culture at these places, especially their Zoomer employees, are probably driving this as well, just in an atmospheric sense. So they want to avoid the HR problems. They want to avoid the bad PR. There's also the ESG and LGBTQIA rating agencies so they're courting the A+ rating from inclusivity orgs. So there's that aspect. Well, and this was clear with Bud Light, maybe partly. I think it's clear with Target. They look at the polling numbers on what their youngest shoppers, say their youngest 10-year demo of shoppers, think about all these issues when they're polled. That is Zoomer polling on, how everyone should regard our new panoply of identities. And they're worried about hooking and then keeping the new youngest demographic of shoppers. So there's all these it's probably misplaced in a way, much like finger to the wind politicians. I think corporate infrastructure can be too reactive and not think creatively enough about this sort of thing. I mean, if there's one thing that Steve Jobs and Apple taught us, it's that supply in a way and innovation can create its own demand rather than just chasing what you think is public opinion on this stuff. So there's the groupthink aspect too, but I find the whole phenomenon fascinating. I wonder how it would be very interesting to see, like, it seems like from this, I was sort of Seth's opinion that this Bud Light boycott wouldn't work because I just thought it wouldn't really penetrate through most of the country. But maybe we're at the tipping point of enough people seeing this sort of thing, even in flyover America on their smartphones in various applications, that this type of culture war inspired boycott really can work in a way that it wouldn't maybe as early as 2000 or as late as 2015 before the combination of culture war and digital tech went into hyperdrive because of Trump. I'm just musing about this stuff. It's the whole thing's worth a lot of thought.
Doesn't it become sort of less ideological the more egregious it gets? That, like,
yeah,
you might have a set of convictions or even spiritual commitments that would lead you to react strongly against some of this stuff, like 5 years ago. But now it's like you don't even have to have a theory of the case. You just have to sort of look at this stuff and be like, ugh, not that. Like, my politics is whatever gets us the opposite of that. And I think like there's something about that energy. It's also really interesting, Ryan, this thing that you're kind of indicating about, like, inertia and momentum, right? I just want to bring up the other sort of big flashpoint that's been going on in this debate, which is the Dodgers and their Pride Night, which they've been doing since like 2013. So there's that kind of inertia, sort of baked in, that it was sort of understood, it seems, in certain corporate circles, that this was just what you did to appease certain moneyed interests. And as long as people didn't freak out about it too much, maybe there would be some hand waving, but you just kind of roll right along into, like, we're going to have a Pride Night. And then the corporations got caught on the back foot, I think, by how every year this stuff had gotten more and more offensive to people. And now the Dodgers have chosen to honor with a Community Hero Award this drag group, the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, who, openly and as part of their brief, they mock Catholic ritual, they dress up as nuns. And in a world where, like, drag is itself this big hot button issue, this sparked a bunch of outrage. And there was this really interesting little drama that unfolded that kind of encapsulates some of what we're talking about, I think, where first they just seem to have done this without thinking too hard about it. Then a few Catholic groups really, made this visible and got a lot of people kind of incensed about it. And then the Dodgers backed off and were pressured again by the countervailing group, which is, I would suspect, the kind of numerical minority. I mean, Dodgers fans composed largely of, like, our Latinx brethren, unlikely to really feel the desperate need for the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence to be honored at their ball game. But, like, nevertheless, there is this huge apparatus that I think is best explained by the stuff James was talking about, that this is like a theological shift that's been going on in the heart and the mind of man for, like, a long time. Since we're in the business of reading Marxist and Soviet quotes here on this podcast, on this here pod, I just want to throw my own into the mix. And this is Alexei Gastev at the dawn of Soviet rule in Russia, 1918, a kind of futurist poet who writes that when all is said and done and the real revolution is complete, mankind will be soulless and devoid of personality, emotion, and lyricism, no longer expressing himself through screams of pain or joyful laughter, but rather through a manometer or taxometer. Mass engineering will make man a social automation. And this idea comes right out of Marx of the homo faber, which is like the craftsman, man as craftsman. I think doesn't get enough play or understanding that it's craftsman of, like, the nature that formed him, that he comes out of these blind forces of nature, becomes self-aware, and then turns his own, like, technological impulse in on his own body to make himself one with his machines. And, like, yeah, that is a huge, even if it doesn't have, like, financial backing, or rather, if it doesn't have buy-in from consumers, like, that's a huge, long tidal wave of kind of thought trends. And that this Dodgers thing, in a weird way, it's like the competing impulses of, like, normal people being like, no, do not want. Let me do capitalism and sort of express my do not wantness. And then this juggernaut of, I would say, ultimately kind of satanic ideology, that when this thing takes on a life of its own and starts to just tear people apart from the inside, then like you actually aren't going to answer every question by the power of the almighty dollar. Like people are in a theological fight at that point. And I think it's, it's going to take some kind of spiritual awareness, at least, of what we're up against to really like bring this thing home, rather than just like, oh, we're going to vote with our feet or whatever.
Yeah, it'd be while you're describing that, Spencer, referencing back to what James was talking about, I thought of like how quaint now the reading would be if we went back to Bush's Council on Bioethics run by Leon Cass.
Yeah.
And it made me then think that the next Republican president, should there ever be one, just a running joke here on this podcast, our pessimism about that, everyone, should appoint a council on transhumanism. That might be pretty interesting. I mean, these councils are always kind of feckless, but they do create a historical record, and they're the opportunity to bring a bunch of interesting and sharp minds together to think through this question. I wonder what the sort of response from the left would be to that, given our accelerated descent into depravity and nihilism since the Council on Bioethics was formed back in whenever that was, 2001 or 2.
I have a question too. I mean, what does winning look like when it comes to a boycott? What does success actually look like? Because the company's already captured. Are we trying to make it? We're trying to kill it, or are we trying to reform? Like, what does that look like? What does winning look like?
I mean, it definitely seems like there are a range of strategies that are currently in play all at once on the right. Like one is the sort of build your own economy model, which is exemplified by our friends at New Founding, by the Daily Wire. This I'm oversimplifying, but it's like, go, don't give your money to brands that hate you. Make stuff that people can enjoy and use in this like kind of big tent way that isn't even necessarily expressly conservative so much as just, you're not going to get a side of castration with your applesauce or whatever. And the hope, I guess, there is that eventually that is so much more appealing than whatever these kind of kooks and transhumanists are selling, that becomes the real economy, or it like takes over. And then the alternative, is to there's this like, can you take down the master's house with the master's tools, right? That the girls on Red Scare are always talking about. The alternative is like to win these victories of the kind that we're winning at Target, where people, have to roll things back, or Bud Light like can't move off the shelves. And my basic attitude here is like, let 1,000 flowers bloom. I don't see why we can't do both. Yeah, and I certainly think that they shouldn't feel comfortable doing this stuff ever. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think just quickly, I think I've talked too much already, but I think a good combo, Helen, would be to, as much as possible, demand that said company drive this sort of messaging out of the corporate public square and the marketing public square, while at the same time, I would think there would be some lasting effects to reputation, corporate reputation, that would open some more space for what Spencer's talking about, which is the kind of two economies thing, that is, a red economy and a blue economy. We are so divided on so many things that we need a kind of corporate federalism and economic federalism to go along with what we also need, which is a much more robust, real federalism, if we're going to keep living together while we continue to argue these things out.
Surely the answer to the, like, what if we founded a council on transhumanism question is that transhumanism would be even more strongly identified than it already is as a dangerous conspiracy theory, right? Like, it's not happening. It's good that it is. It seems like the obvious move on that end.
Yeah. And then half of it would come true in 2 years later. So that you could say, see, told you.
Yeah.
Not a conspiracy theory.
Well, right. There is this like slippery slope remains undefeated dimension of this whole thing, right? That since these things do manifest in this very on the nose way that Helen is describing, that these arguments become more and more persuasive in their general outlines, no matter which of their like particulars you might dispute. So you might be like, well, there were some things that feminism did that were good and some things that were bad at the beginning, and then it got taken over by whatever. You can, people involve themselves in telling a million stories and parsing these pairs, and sometimes usefully. But like at a certain point, when we're this far down the line, you start to also think like, well, whatever the process was of getting here, we're obviously up against a coherent thing. And I think it's like kind of the end of something in a weird way. And that like the trends that James was describing earlier on, you guys can tell me what you think about this. Like, because they have reached this obvious like crisis point where they think they've got the tech in their hands that they can really do it for real this time. Like, it feels like whatever is going to come next, if it's their triumph, then it's sort of the end of the world. But alternatively, it's like this is the sort of dying gasp of this really just sort of anti-human and evil ideology, and whatever comes next, maybe good, maybe ugly, whatever, but it'll be something sort of profoundly different.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, it's easy to associate Marxism with Karl Marx, and he was certainly the more productive of the pair, Marx and Engels. But Engelsism is the thing, and the sort of like post-Jewish worldview of Karl Marx syncs up particularly well with the post-Protestant worldview of Engels. And that's an important part of the puzzle, because, underlying that post-Protestant, I mean, you look at Engels and it's like one of those guys, like the black and white photo of when they were young, and it was like hot Engels, like hot Stalin, and like those other guys. Like, sort of like handsome bohemian dude who like came from like a wealthy burgher family of like hardworking, like, thrifty industrialists, and bummed around Europe, spent a lot of time in London, like he was German, but was he really? He sort of thought of himself as like European and knew English and whatever. And his parents were concerned that he was underemployed. Stop me if this sounds familiar. Yeah. Devout Protestants. And they end up just like supporting him to just like sit at home and write fan fiction about how, we're going to immanentize the eschaton. And like this, this too has been going on for a long time. And that kind of Gnostic impulse seems to be, looking back, reviewing religious history of the West, seems to be something that just cannot be like beaten out of either Christianity or Judaism. It just seems to be a temptation that is forever there and forever sort of like luring people in. And so, even if there's kind of like some kind of crushing blow of the pendulum swinging back against transhumanists and posthumanists, man, that Gnostic temptation, that longing for the secret knowledge to reveal that which is hidden and to shatter the clay vessels created by the demiurge and let the pure spirit out, that stuff is probably never going to go away, at least until the end of time and space as we know it.
To which we can all look forward with great enthusiasm.
Well, yeah, your mileage may vary.
Right.
The end of human space and time is not necessarily something to be dreaded, depending on various factors.
Right. Well, it's certainly coming. It's like you don't have to bring it upon yourself. That's the funny. The immanentizing the eschaton thing always makes me laugh. It's like, it's like when people say, I want to go out there and suffer, because I don't feel like I really lived life until I've suffered. It's like, it's gonna come to you, bro. Like you probably don't want to hasten the day. Okay, well, having now reached, to my satisfaction, an extreme of theological speculation and apocalyptic maundering, I'll only identify the maundering with myself, but I will turn our attention now to a Twitter controversy that is probably more than just a Twitter controversy, and also has bearing on a lot of what we have just been talking about, and speaks to kind of a higher order set of questions about realignment and just political coalition building. So, full disclosure, I think like all of us sort of variously know the people involved in various ways. And so what I'm going to try to do here is just lay out the inciting tweet thread that led us to want to talk about this and open it up to you guys for your thoughts. Yoram Hazony, whom many listeners to this podcast will know as, an advocate of author of Conservatism, a Rediscovery, advocate of nationalism in the 21st century, takes to Twitter to give an account of what James Lindsay, he of so-called Squared fame, sort of interpreter of postmodernist doctrine, mathematician, close reader of postmodernism, if I can put it this way. James Lindsay has been in a bunch of fights with a group of people which he designates as Christian nationalists, and we'll get into the term and his use of it in a sec. But here's what Hazony lays out as what he understands James Lindsay's sort of beef to be, why James is currently raising a lot of alarm about Christian nationalism and the Christian right generally. I'm going to read some of Yoram's tweets here. The first thing to understand about where James's head is right now is that he believes conservative Christianity is about to be largely politically nullified in the United States. This isn't a long-term prediction. James has said repeatedly that the destruction of conservative Christian influence is going to happen in a massive attack by the left over the coming summer. And to summarize what follows, as Yoram represents James, the summer of 2023 is going to be the summer when the woke left attempts to mobilize trans in the same way that it mobilized BLM and racialism in the summer of 2020. And that in that moment, the Christians of the right are going to be cast as the great Satan and then be the object of violence, scorn, exclusion from society, unpersoning, under the pretext that they're committing violence against trans people. James seems to feel that the Christians have already lost this culture war and that the secular anti-woke movement needs to distance itself as far as possible from anything that bears the whiff of Christian nationalism. And this is where we get into his use of that term, which is not what I think any of us would use it to mean. I mean, Christian nationalism has a sort of specific set of players and ideological commitments, some of which are held by the people that James mentions, but many of which are not. So he talks about, Stephen Wolfe, who I think would accept the label, but he also, talks about like Aaron Wren, who I don't think would. And it seems like for him, Christian nationalism means like post-liberal conservatism with theological commitments. And so that is the fight as Yoram describes it. And I think also as, I think James describes it in a nutshell. I've tried as much as possible to unpick some of these threads here. Without further comment, let me just open it up to the group and ask, do you think that Yoram's assessment is accurate? What does this tell us about the future of the right?
I will just defend our inclusion of this somewhat esoteric debate. I'm the one who suggested it, so if anyone's mad,
please, yeah,
if anyone's mad, they can be mad at me.
But no, why am I talking about this, Ryan?
This is the type of debate that I think, especially for our listeners who are not online as much and not on Twitter as much, would otherwise miss, but I think is very interesting because just a larger context setting explanation real quick. James Lindsay was a leading critic, is a kind of leading critic from a philosophical point of view. And he's read all the post-structuralist literature. He's a diagnostician of wokeism and has been a strong advocate against transing your kids and feeding them a bunch of, for lack of a better term, culturally Marxist, sexually charged stuff in kindergarten and forward. He throws around the groomer label plenty. So it's not like he's a left-winger, but he is a liberal in the post-New Deal sense on issues of social conservatism. So the other epithet he was throwing at was at the homophobic Christian nationalists. And so James's theory of the case, and Yoram points it out that it's for different reasons. It's also Curtis Yarvin's theory of the case, which is that this fight is going to be lost by normal folk who happen to be Christian populists of a certain strain, or just normal Christian citizens in the country. Like, you cannot win this culture war, so you need to adopt a different approach. That's really James's point of view. And I think Yoram pushing back against it in an intelligent way was an interesting thing to do. I did not expect to see that from Yoram Hazony. He's thought a lot about it. He even reports he talked to Curtis Yarvin for 2 hours to try to understand why culture warrioring was a bad idea from Curtis's point of view. So I just wanted to raise it because it's one of these somewhat in the weeds debates on the kind of politically active, intellectually rich right, broadly speaking, very broadly speaking. And I think we should take seriously James's prediction. Yoram doesn't. I think at the end of his thread, Yoram maybe disputes that it's coming next summer, or that we'll lose that this summer, or that we'll lose the fight. I just think it's interesting. I think James's observation in the first bit of this podcast about, I see this stuff now in my timeline every hour. It seems like something is building from the forces on the left to try to keep forcing this question and to draw out. It would be not a crazy strategic move if you were on the left to try to provoke the Christian right, for lack of a better term, to do something stupid. I mean, Charlottesville benefited the left quite a bit. It certainly benefited Joe Biden. The sort of summer of BLM also benefited the left, hurt Trump in a sort of diffuse way, benefited Joe Biden. And January 6th as well, what really benefited the forces of establishment Washington, which I would argue these days are decidedly left-wing in various ways. So James's prediction is not crazy. And so if you were watching all that from the left side of American politics, you would think, I wonder if this is another opportunity for us to force our enemies to do something stupid and then to use that crisis and not let it go to waste. So that part of James's predictions is not crazy, although I disagree with James that the quote unquote Christian nationalists in America, will necessarily lose every argument or will be driven from public life and will have no influence after this summer, meaning, in 2 months.
I'm just not, I agree with you to a certain extent. I'm just not so sure that the division is so trenchant that you could provoke like a mass response like what we saw in 2020. I mean, there's a lot of people around who not in bad, like they'll credibly accept the idea that America is shot through with white supremacy and that racial violence from white supremacists is this major problem. And, we would dispute that. You can sort of accept, okay, well, whatever, they can make this argument, they can accept this argument. I just don't see that taking hold on the level of homophobia, anti-gay discrimination, that America is shot through with homophobia and that, trans suicide has been this disguised problem for centuries. So to me, it just, look, is the left always trying to provoke the right to commit some outrage? Yes. But will it be bad enough, even if they do manage to provoke it, to, then counter-provoke another reaction on the level of summer of 2020? I don't know. One thing that Yoram Hazony pointed out that I thought was very, very smart about both James Lindsay and Curtis Yarvin is there is this tendency for very bright people to checkmate themselves. Okay, well, this will happen, and then that will happen, and then that will happen, and then this will happen. Therefore, everything's foreclosed or forecluded in advance. QED, no one should do anything. The game is lost. It's all lost from the very first move. History will work this way, and it's basically a mechanized process, and therefore there's no way we can win. There's no reason to bother, give up. And I think there's a kind of defeatism to it. And the idea that trans and the LGBT agenda is already so much a part of culture that there's no way that we can push back against it. Get ready to have all your kids transed. I don't know. I think that there's yet some room here.
Yeah, It puts me in mind a bit, Ryan, of one of your favorite memes, the FBI, the feds poking the Pepe frog with a stick and saying do a racism. Or do a terrorism. And I think that, Seth, as you say, there's always not only the possibility, but the likelihood that part of the left's strategy is to force the right into such a frenzy of defensiveness and anger that their response, while actually understandable and commensurate with the problem is also like impolitic and sort of paints with too broad a brush and is easily caricatured. And I think that for me, that means that like James's best point, James Lindsay, not our James, is that he often will ask people who attack him on this, like, okay, what do you want, right? Like, what is the actual program that you're advocating for? Because if we end up in a position where it's like, not only do we have critiques of liberalism, but we're actually like anti-liberal or illiberal, and we basically want to establish like we you know, you call us theocrats, we actually want that, and we want like a world of sort of strict individually mandated social morality, then I think we will have made a misstep. I think that's an error. What I don't think is smart is to have that conversation in the context of like some absolute certainty about a crisis that is definitely going to unfold, and let's panic immediately. What I actually think we should be asking ourselves in a slightly more like calm way is, what in fact do we want? What is our positive program, you know, to counter wokeness? And what does the world look like that is sort of sane and normal with respect to like kind of any range, but like gay people and women and like all of these sort of so-called aggrieved groups, you know, what life are we offering them? Because I do think that's a legitimate question that is unresolved in the sort of among the many people that Lindsay is identifying. But I don't think that, like it's probably unhelpful to do that in this way of where you've already determined like what the end game is going to be, and we should panic and act now.
Yeah, what my take is on the Christian nationalism thing is, I'm going to try to like condense it a lot for this moment. I flash back with a shudder on one of the most painful pieces of criticism I received in grad school from a professor, which was an exegesis is supposed to make a text easier to understand, not harder to understand. And so I'm going to try not to be like too obscurantist here, but Christian nationalism sounds like it means something very specific, but you can look about the country and notice that there are, you know, lots of like dark Biden nationalists out there, and there are lots of Christian churches, at least that's what it says in the building, and that's what kind of looks like what they are, waving, you know, the current flag, larger and more prominent than any sort of representation of Christ or the cross. And so, you know, this too is Christian nationalism of a sort, fully automated, luxury, woke, trans communism with Christian nationalist characteristics. That's, you know, when Alexis de Tocqueville says, like, in a democratic age, the concept of unity becomes an obsession. It is an arms race to come up with the most comprehensive and transcendent idea of unity, and to operationalize that unity as the political frame. And in a country such as ours, where the bog standard definition of nationalism, of nation, does not quite apply. And I think the founders were clear on that. Doesn't mean that America is not a nation. Just means that it can't really think about it or understand it the way you can think of the nations of the old world. In a nation such as that, the pressure and the temptation and at least in the short term, the payoff of imposing a national identity by coming up with the most overarching, transcendent, unifying concept of all time, that is all very strong. And I think that's why wokeness is getting the traction that it is, because you can wokeify anything. You can slap that flag on anything. You can integrate anything into it. It is an operating system for the Borg. And with a Borg as powerful and potent and omnipresent as ours is in America, it needs that operating system. It needs the ghost in the machine. It needs the priestly caste catechizing the bots. There needs to be a doctrine. There needs to be an algorithm. Technology is never neutral in that way. It's always quote unquote biased in one direction or another. And so there's this struggle over what the ultimate, you know, the prime directive, the ultimate programming is. And that's something that the US has been susceptible to, I think, since the beginning. And so when we're casting about for an understanding of Christian nationalism in the United States, we've got this sort of predicament where, well, Christianity in the US, I mean, let's face it, it's basically been a cult factory, and just faction after subfaction of like variously heretical and bizarre offshoots of Christianity spiraling off in many directions, some of which are sort of more legitimate in the US than others. But, there's no end in sight there, even as Christianity seems to be like dying off or whatever. I mean, I think the best way to understand that, this is Ross Douthat was on the case of this a while ago, is just, let a thousand heresies bloom. That's the way that it has been. That's the way that it is. Christianity is this kind of like messy question mark. And then nationalism is kind of this messy question mark. So how do we orient ourselves? Well, you want to go back to the founders. You want to go back to the Federalist. What does it say there? And I think basically what it says there is America is this sort of thing that obviously pre-existed the Constitution, pre-existed the founding. Well, what was it? Well, it was a certain slice of space-time that was bounded geographically. You got these big oceans on either side. Canada is kind of there, but you go 50 paces too far north and it's just the Arctic. Mexico's kind of there, but it tapers off down to sort of a jungle isthmus, and America's this kind of clearly demarcated block on the globe that is unlike the other places. And it has a certain set of human beings there, a kind of founding people. And that stock is still more or less the prevailing stock in the United States. Obviously, lots of immigrants and newcomers and waves people and, it's former slaves and their descendants and on. But in spite of it all, still like stable enough that that we can just like argue about our past and heap scorn on our past and fight about our past instead of having just forgotten our past, which sometimes happens to people's over long enough timeline. So the founders sort of look at this primal America and they say, okay, well, if there's going to be one government, one regime for this time, sort of geographically and demographically bound slice of space-time, then what kind of regime is that going to be? And we have to get this right, because if the regime is mismatched to the people in the place where you find the people, then it's going to fail. And, Aristotle knew that. Some other folks knew that. Not really controversial. So what kind of government is going to both be a good government, a well-constructed government, and one that is well-fitted to the people and to the place in which those people are to be found? And the founders say, well, okay, it's basically going to be a large republic. There has never been a large republic. All the small republics have seemed kind of good sometimes. Ultimately, they failed, very unstable. This is the new world, not the old world. We're going to do a large republic for the first time. It's going to be a big test of political science and our ability to understand the lessons of political history and apply them to new situations. Okay, so large republic. What is going to make this large republic work in a way that not even small republics have been able to work for very long? Well, commerce. America is going to be a large commercial republic. Okay, and so it has been, and that has, exacerbated or intensified those temptations to kind of launch off in the direction of the supreme overarching idea, because commerce in a large country is going to be very generative, but also generative probably of oligarchs. And oligarchs are inclined to centralize their class interests, centralize their wealth, centralize their power. Tocqueville thought that it was kind of unstable oligarchy. He said it's hard to tell whether it's like on its way to becoming a democracy or just like still leaving the train station of aristocracy. In some ways that's right, but gosh, that can last for a very long time. And so, if we're trying to sort of distinguish like a Christian nationalism that accords pretty well with the America that we've inherited versus a Christian nationalism that accords like poorly with the America that we inherited or is like actively hostile to the America that we inherited, well, then, okay, so then it's got to be a Christian nationalism that comports with the necessities and the habits of a large commercial republic that does not get too oligarchic, that is distributed in some way so that the people can participate in, but also kind of organize and orchestrate commercial life and civic life in a way that doesn't reduce them to just sort of like consumers or plebiscitarians. And I think that's really sort of like what's most at stake as we try to sort this out. Yes, the theological stuff is important. Yes, the culture war stuff, obviously very important. yes, the technology is very important, but kind of what ties it all together for the purposes of like seeing America through this process? Well, if you want one regime, one country, one nation, one republic, then you got to turn your attention on how is commercial life distributed. Because if it is concentrated, if it's as concentrated as the government that we now have, as the regime that we now have, then what you see is, you see people just sort of slipping into this kind of like passivity and perversity and idleness and all of these kind of hallmarks of decline in the vitality and the virtue of the people that I think are, Spencer, as you suggested, it is this is what the kind of this is the petri dish that grows wokeness in its dysfunction and its perversity so well. If you disconnect people from their ability to function together in a civic way and in an economic commercial way, then it seems very likely that we're going to be stuck with what we've got right now. So how we get past that and back in the direction of bending technology once again, bending our habits once again, our aspirations, to really restoring the lifeblood of a large commercial republic that is not a despotism. I think that's the big question.
Whew. And that's the condensed view. So, sign up for the full assessment on AmericanMind.org. No, I'm only teasing you, James. That was very illuminating, and I think it's a good place for us to turn to our final segment this week and every week. It's called Read the Damn Site. We have a website. It's called AmericanMind.org. You will like it. If somehow you are listening to my voice and you've never been there, go now. Every week, we like to pick out a piece, each of us, that we found particularly thought-provoking or interesting that you should check out. And I, as per the developing tradition, will start us off. Carl Trueman is somebody whom you probably know, but if you don't, you should. He had a book recently, The Rise and Triumph of the Postmodern Self, that made a real splash, especially given the fact that it's quite intellectually rich and substantive. He also has written for the Claremont Review of Books, our big sister publication, and now he's made his debut in the American Mind, talking about some of the things that we've been discussing here. We've been running a series of pieces on the reality of evil and the supernatural elements of it that need recognition if you're going to make sense of things. And Carl writes a very, I think, smart piece, bringing up something that I had also found really interesting, but hadn't seen addressed quite this way or quite so well. And that is the reappraisal of the character of Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann, well known to many as the subject of Hannah Arendt's book, or Hannah Arendt's book, I guess, Eichmann in Jerusalem, subtitle, A Study in the Banality of Evil. And Arendt's thesis was that this guy represented just the classic cog in the machine. He was a Nazi functionary. He didn't have grand ideological visions. He didn't have aspirations to greatness. He was just doing kind of like the everyday tasks of the bureaucrat. And because the bureaucracy itself was evil, he was folded into the kind of logic of this machine. It became apparent in subsequent research that this was not really an accurate or a full assessment of Eichmann himself, even, let alone evil full stop. And so, sort of against the banality of evil, Trueman argues for the aesthetics of evil, the appeal and desire that it evokes in those that find themselves caught up in its maw, especially to do with meaning, aspiration, goals, things that are not readily forthcoming in the modern world too often. And as we've been discussing, even if your project is evil, if you offer that project with a kind of fervor and a clear picture of the future, however bleak it may be, you are likely to gain adherence over a kind of milquetoast, banal good. So it's called The Allure of Evil. It's on the site somewhere in our front page. Well, if you flip through the pieces that are up there, Carl R. Trueman, go check it out. Helen, what's on your mind?
I'm going to try to speak quickly so I don't get interrupted by my children. But Berkey Nationalism by Kevin Roberts. This was from the comments he gave at NatCon UK. Definitely go read it. But that and a lot of other great stuff came out of NatCon UK.
Seth, what's yours?
Well, I enjoyed this piece by another person at the Heritage Foundation, Brenda Hefera, and it's called The Role of Technology in Family Formation. And she looks at, the declining marriage rates, in the West and in the developed world, and declining fertility. And, kind of goes through a lot of the questions regarding technology and how, porn addiction, dating apps may actually not be doing such a great job at fulfilling this. And she makes a really good point that, I guess it used to be seen that marriage was something that young people would commence. That's how they would commence their adult lives, like pairing up and getting married. But now marriage is seen as like the capstone. Like, this is what you do once you've arrived at a certain level of professional success and you're ready to enter middle age. That's when you get married. It was an interesting point. So I would recommend taking a look at it. I like this piece.
James, what do you got?
What do I got? I mean, it's always an embarrassment of riches at AmericanMind.org, but now more than ever, it seems. I was tempted to talk for more than 10 seconds about Ben Braddock's piece on RFK Jr., which is now from May 11th, which apparently is like many days ago. I don't know what calendar we're on. We're on the accelerationist calendar, I think. That's worth a look. David Sachs giving RFK a boost, and in mere minutes, maybe even seconds, at the time of recording here, he's going to be moderating the Ron DeSantis Twitter presidential announcement space, Twitter space. So watch that space, read a little bit about RFK. I know if you are a boomer listening, you've probably already read the RFK piece multiple times, because nothing gets our beloved boomers reading like Kennedy content. But I want to talk about suffering. They are always wrong, a piece by Adam Ellwinger that went up on the 18th, a little bit closer to current moment. This is, to me, like a very provocative piece, but one that must be wrestled with. Just a quote here from the piece. As a Christian, I believe that every life has value. In a cosmic sense, it is a tragedy that Neely is gone. Talking about the gentleman who ran afoul of Daniel Penny on the New York subway, menacing passengers, put into a sleeper hold, and ultimately died. In a cosmic sense, it is a tragedy that Neely's gone, but thousands, perhaps millions of people die tragically and unjustly every day all over the world. In a pragmatic sense, I don't care about their deaths either, says Ellwinger. I can't do anything to stop tragic, unjust death because in large part, life is tragic and unjust. If we adopt a broader view that includes all the tragic, unjust death in the world, the fact is that I never hear about 99.999% of it. The 0.001% of it that I do hear about is made up of events that are quote unquote newsworthy, either because the circumstances that attend them are especially extraordinary or because the particular death in question stands as emblematic of a larger issue or concern. This is heavy stuff, but we do live in a communications bubble, sphere, enclosure that is so heavily mediated and so heavily orchestrated that any isolated event can be used as a tool to hack the collective consciousness. We see this happen all the time. It is totally exhausting. It is totally alienating. It is profoundly unnatural. It is something that we are not well equipped to deal with. And it is a major source of the intensity and velocity of the culture war, the propaganda war, the cold civil war, the omnivore. Christian or no, read the piece, ponder it, meditate on it. It speaks to major issues that run to the core of who we are and what we're trying to do in this country and as human beings, all within 600, 700 words. Give it a read.
Yep, definitely a must read is that one, as is Adam whenever he writes, but that one in particular. I think that the rapid recession, as May 11th recedes rapidly into the past, we have our strongest argument yet for some sort of reset on the calendar. Maybe, I don't know, a year zero that would just kind of wipe the slate clean. Maybe something to think about. Last but not least, Ryan, what do you got?
I have this excerpt from Kevin Slack's new book, the new book being called War on the American Republic, How Liberalism Became Despotism. So it's kind of in the oldie but goodie category thematically, although it's a new book, of Claremont's assessment of the left and progressivism. So I recommend it. The excerpt we have is called The Constitution, Citizenship, and the New Right. Kevin is a young-ish, I think Kevin is just barely not Gen X. I think he's about my age. 41, maybe a couple years older. So a young scholar who does a lot of great work, teaches these days at Hillsdale. And Kevin has a piece here that I think could be a bridge to the portion of our audience that kind of it's found its way to us through our engagement with, for lack of a better term, the dissident online right over the years, may be skeptical of the American founding, maybe a portion of them, even though they may not be integralists of various stripes, think that the problem was baked in the cake at the beginning of the founding. Kevin does not hold that view, yet he's very well versed in the solid critiques of and anxieties about the modern American state held by those folks on the dissident right or the Catholic right or the trad right or whatever that are inclined to agree politically with, broadly speaking, the Claremont Institute's project and how we speak about contemporary politics, but maybe are skeptical of our attachment to the principles of the American founding and the founders, et cetera. Kevin's maybe a good bridge figure for that. He's a great. This is not it's a scholarly book in the sense that Kevin knows all this stuff. There's all the endnotes and everything, but he's a good polemicist as well, and just appreciates the stakes of the current regime and its corruption and badness. So it could be a nice book for those on both sides of the aisle, the old Claremontsters who want a fresh take updated to current times, as well as newer audience members for the podcast, for the American Mind website, for any Claremont material, who are maybe interested about plumbing, going a little deeper. Read the excerpt and then go buy the book.
Yep, absolutely. And more to come on that as well on the site as we invite responses and
excellent.
Around that excerpt. So well said. And with that, we are going to log right off and then log right back on so that we can all go listen to the aforementioned Ron DeSantis presidential campaign announcement Twitter space. We didn't talk about it today because it's happening right as we wrap, but I'm sure we'll have more to say about it anon. So with that, we will thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you would like to know more about our projects at the Claremont Institute, you can visit our website. Already mentioned AmericanMind.org. I also gave a nod to our big sister publication at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com. You can visit Claremont.org or Claremont.org/donate to help support us in our work. And you can check out our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Most importantly, don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We accept appreciation in the form of 5-star reviews only. If your opinion amounts to less than 5 stars, tell it to your cat, call your mom, but keep it to yourself in the broader sphere of the internet. All right, folks, thanks to our production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri, and thanks to you all very much for listening. We will talk to you next week.